course, in the First World War, and yet the Soviet Union, of course, invaded Hungary in 1956 and then Czechoslovakia in 1968 in contravention of that principle. So where does that leave us today? First, as I said, the 14 points were the origin point of the US strategy of containment toward Russian communism. But it was more than that. As already mentioned, it was a founding document in the construction of a US-led liberal international order, an order that, as solidified after 1945, has undergirded international relations for the better part of a century. Specifically on self-determination, it's an order this international order is based on the proliferation of self-determining states. We had 20-something states in the world around the time of World War I, or around the time of the peace conference. We now have close to 200. That's self-determination at work. This led, on one hand, to more accountable governments, and on the other hand, to weak state and inflexible territorial configurations, among other problems. So thinking about the 14 points highlights the difficulties of constructing and preserving such an order. In particular, it highlights the contradictions embedded in such a project. Thinking of the 14 points as a founding document of the liberal order also reminds us that it is an order that is now facing unprecedented challenges, not least from the very place, not far from here, in which it was drafted. Now, the current circumstances, and historians always have to say this, are very different from those of a century ago. Still, just as Wilson understood the international upheavals of his time as part of a broader set of historical processes that encompass both the domestic and the international arenas, as we saw the same large-scale processes at work both at home and abroad, we too must think of our own challenges in a way that puts developments both at home and abroad within a single analytical frame. Now, what do we see if we do that? We see a recent past in our time of accelerating globalization, of large-scale immigration, of economic and technological change tied to crises and dislocations, and we see a steep rise of inequality that is challenging long-standing social contracts and political institutions in the US and abroad. By the way, many of these institutions that are being challenged, at least in the United States, go back to Wilson's own time. Now, like Wilson 100 years ago, America today is faced with the challenges of finding a path of reform, a third way between plutocracy and upheaval. And one more thing, the odd coupling of Wilson and Lenin a century ago cannot but remind us of possibly an equally odd relationship between the US president and the Russian leader today. Now, Putin's authoritarian nationalism may not have the universal ambitions of Lenin's communist internationalism, but the two share a disdain for democracy and a desire to exploit its weakness and to destabilize and perhaps destroy it. In his own time, Wilson understood that to face the challenges of globalization, he must push for a more responsive, accountable politics both at home and abroad. It is this insight I put before you that lay at the core of the 14 points, however flawed Wilson's efforts to implement it were. And I think it remains a fundamental insight today. Thank you.
There we go. Well, I want to thank CSIS, thank Mark, and thank Senator Warner for all of your hospitality in bringing us all here together. At the U.S. Army War College, where I teach, we tend to teach war and peace as two sides of the same coin, but it seems to me that this is too simple and not quite right. War is a reaction to crisis, something like a 9/11, something like a Pearl Harbor, something like Germany resuming unrestricted submarine warfare in the spring of 1917, whereas peace is genuinely about grand strategy. What do you want the world to look like? What resources do you have to make it look that way? And what barriers, what limitations do you have to face? And that's one way to think about the 14 points, as a vision of what the world should look like and a vision of what the United States ought to do to make it look that way. Now, what I want to show you here is that grand strategy is really, really difficult to do. So I'm going to focus on those shortcomings and limitation ends of what the 14 points means. And I want to do it by introducing you to somebody else whose initials were WW. This is William Lynn Westerman, a professor of history in the summer of 1917. He was a man from Belleville, Illinois, educated in the United States and educated, ironically enough, in Germany. In the summer of 1917, he was a history professor at the University of Wisconsin. He was a world specialist on Egyptian papyrus scrolls. Hard to get more esoteric than that. Hard to get a little bit more mild-mannered than that. Here he is as part of this group which has come up before the inquiry, this group that's formed in September 1917. I found the initial document. Senator, I don't know if this has ever been done before in U.S. government history, but they're given the authority to spend whatever money they want. The bills are to be sent to the White House. And they put together this core group, which goes with Wilson to Paris in 1919, but they're actually formed in September 1917. And as Jennifer mentioned, many of the individuals in this image here go on to form the Council on Foreign Relations. So we really can think of them as the world's first, or America's first, real think tank. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that William Westerman is put on this committee because by studying Egyptian papyrus scrolls, he is somehow one of America's experts on the Middle East. On December 11th, 1919, William Lynn Westerman finds himself in Paris discussing with the British and the French whether or not the city of Constantinople should be given to Turkey or to Greece. And to me, there's a really interesting symbolism in that. In the 2 years, this man, like the United States, goes from having no interest whatsoever in what happens to Turkey or Greece or Constantinople to actually having a voice in that final decision. Now, as Jennifer mentioned, the United States was not really bound by any agreements that it hadn't signed. The United States did not declare war against the Ottoman Empire, yet here the Americans find themselves. And so I want to talk a little bit about that process and trying to work their way through, in a kind of think tank environment, what this means. Now, Westerman, who later went on to become a professor at Columbia University in New York, where his papers are today, was joined by some other really talented academics, and some of them talented but not really nice people. The man sitting in the middle on the couch there is Isaiah Bowman, who later went on to become president of Johns Hopkins, and later at the end of the Second World War was part of another think tank effort to advise Harry Truman on what to do as the British were getting out of Palestine. So these are interesting people whose views mattered an awful lot. Now, Westerman admired a lot of what Woodrow Wilson had done, admired a lot of Wilson's ideals, but he remarked in his diary, no one knows just what is in the president's mind beyond vague phrases and beautiful ideas. Now, as Erez and Jennifer have mentioned, here's one of his vague phrases and beautiful ideas. The peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. Now, the professor in me immediately looks to the passive voice in that construction, should be accorded, without identifying who should accord it. But let's forget that for a minute. Unless one of my students is watching, then remember it absolutely for this moment. And let's forget also the vagueness of the idea. As Jennifer said, the United States declared war on Austria-Hungary very, very late in the game, and the United States was not bound by any international agreement regarding Austria-Hungary. The United States had no plans to get involved in the area, certainly no plans to send troops to the area. Yet here was the inquiry charged with giving Wilson some advice. And another of the vague phrases that Wilson gave to the inquiry was this guidance: tell me what is right, and I will fight for it. Why? What is causing the United States to end up in this position? And I'm going to mention just three that Jennifer and Erez have already mentioned, so I'm repeating a little bit of what they said. First, the United States is in this faute de mieux, meaning that we're in this because of the collapse of most other systems of authority. The Austro-Hungarian Empire itself collapses from within. The United States certainly has no interest in putting it back together, but no other great power, other than perhaps the Russians, has the ability to shape its future. Second, as both previous speakers have also mentioned, the universalist message of Woodrow Wilson. If it applies in one place, it must apply every place. And third, the need to separate the United States from the Bolshevik message of Vladimir Lenin and the Russians. Now, even if the United States did not want to be involved in this problem in Austria-Hungary, or as I'll talk briefly about Syria, or as I won't talk about China, it had largely spun this web for itself. Or in Woodrow Wilson's words to his propagandist George Creel, I am wondering whether you have not unconsciously spun a net from me from which there is no escape. Which seems to me classic Woodrow Wilson, blaming somebody else for his problems, yet softening it a little bit with the word unconsciously. Now, the inquiry is a way out of this. The inquiry is supposed to be progressive in the sense that it is to be scientific. It is to be rational in the sense that it is to proceed along clearly identifiable social science methods, and is supposed to be evidence-based. And my favorite piece of documentation that I found so far in the inquiry files is this great phrase, "The truth is out there." So, the inquiry got to work. And I'm going to show you a couple of maps that are at Yale University's archives today. They start putting together things like this. Detailed analysis. What does the Austro-Hungarian Empire look like? What is it? Who lives there? How do we identify who lives there? These are incredibly detailed and, as you can see, gorgeously produced maps that look at oat production, that look at barley production, that look at where railroads go. Where do canals go? Who lives there? What do we do with them? This map is of the languages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I love the way they tried to do this in an age before PowerPoint and computer programs, by shading different colors of ink to show different levels of intensity. Now, I don't know about you, but this isn't the way I would try to break up an empire, especially as people on the ground are saying, hey, look, these are people that recently moved in. Our claim to the land supersedes their claim to the land. A familiar phrase that we're going to have to be dealing with. It's the progressive mindset. If you get the right data and the right experts, the right answers ought to follow out. But as you can see from this map and from some of the other ones I'm about to show you, the answers aren't quite so simple. How can you make states that are ethnically consistent, economically sustainable, and strategically defensible? And I'll talk about that again in a minute, in just a second. Here's another one of the maps. This is an idea that they come up with. This is a federated Greater Austria based upon ethnic groups. In other words, if you can say that language is a marker of identity, and that itself I understand is a fairly controversial point, maybe the best way to handle this is to draw the lines this way, while keeping some sort of central authority over the entire region. Now, to me, I'm fascinated by ideas like this because they show that in 1919, in 1945, and other parts of history, there were a lot of possible outcomes. The way that history came out doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it was destined to come out, which we historians call hindsight bias. How to put them into action? Let's say for just a moment that this is the future you want to create for Central Europe. How could the Americans actually do it? What modes of influence did the United States have? It's quite clear to everybody, and I'll show you one person in particular, that the United States has no intention of sending the United States Army into that to try to straighten it out and figure it out. It is equally clear that Woodrow Wilson did not want to do this by the power of economics. That is, he did not want to tie the resources of the United States economy into figuring out how to solve the problems of Central and Eastern Europe. He had questions about whether it was legal for him to do so, given that most of those assets were in private hands, and he had moral questions about how to do it. I have a British colleague of mine who insists that this came from his Presbyterian background. I'm not Presbyterian, so I have to trust his analysis on this. He's a religious historian, so I trust him as far as it goes, that forcing people to convert to his ideas was the wrong way to do it. They had to see the wisdom in Wilson's ideas for what they were. Thus, all of his appeals, as Jennifer said, to the publics of Europe over the heads of their leaders. Could a League of Nations do something like this? Could you create an international organization that could go in and somehow monitor this new greater federated Austria that you had in mind? Now, I have no context for the next image that I want to show you, but I find it really interesting. This is another idea that the inquiry came up with. I don't really know how to interpret this so much. This is another suggestion for the way you might order Central Europe. This was going to be, as near as I can figure, 4 states, a Czechoslovak state, which doesn't quite correspond to the boundaries of the Czechoslovakia they created, the claims of the Yugoslavs, which I presume means they're going to create a state there as well, the claims of Serbia and Montenegro as they existed in 1914, and then a yellow state just called Corridor. So I'm not really sure what they thought they were going to be able to accomplish by this, but again, it shows the many ways that they're thinking. And one problem that they quickly realize that they've run into is that it's possible, it may just be possible, to create states that will be ethnically homogeneous. It may also be possible to create states that can feed themselves, that is, are economically sustainable. And it may be possible to create states that can defend themselves. It is not possible to create states that can do all three. What do you want to prioritize? This is what produces ideas like the Polish corridor and the internationalization of the city of Danzig. It's these kinds of ideas that give the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia, right? The understanding that the goals that you want in states, the things you want them to do, are in fact mutually incompatible. And that no matter what you do, one of those three things is going to suffer, even if you can get the people who are actually living there to agree to live under these states. Now, one guy who immediately saw the problems was this man, Tasker Bliss, for whom the building attached to my building is named, and I'm very glad that it is. Bliss was a Pennsylvanian, which I also have to give 2 thumbs up to, educated at Bucknell and educated at West Point. William Lynn Westerman called Bliss, quote, the ablest man in Europe and the one commissioner who will really study and study hard to make himself acquainted with what he must know. Now, when Tasker Bliss was feeling stressed out, he would pour himself a glass of whiskey and he would read Thucydides in the original Greek, right? Something I've advised all senior Army officers to start doing. Now, Bliss understood immediately that some of the core presumptions under which the United States was operating were badly false. One of which is that the American people would be willing to commit their treasure, their resources, their prestige to enforcing whatever agreement came out of Versailles. Now, Bliss, in my mind, is a slightly tragic figure because Wilson paid him almost no attention at the Paris Peace Conference, and I think he got it as well, as close to right as anybody that was there. The way they set it up is they listed 5, each country got 5 representatives at the peace conference. Bliss did not make the list. Georges Clemenceau wanted to insult his senior general, Ferdinand Foch, so he put Foch's name 6th on the list of 5. This is what Bliss said about these new states you wanted to create in Central Europe. He said, quote, the submerged nations are coming to the surface. As soon as they appear, they fly at someone's throat. They are like mosquitoes, vicious from the moment of their birth. In other words, just because a state is new, just because it's small, and just because it's homogeneous, does not necessarily mean that it's virtuous. And Bliss was particularly upset that the United States was taking its surplus weaponry in Europe and selling it to these new countries. Bliss had the idea that you should put those weapons on ships, wait till the ships were about halfway over the Atlantic Ocean coming back to the United States, and dump them all overboard. Get rid of them. Now, a second problem that Bliss ended up getting involved in, and a second set of beautiful phrases and ideas. I won't read this one out, but this is about the Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire. What to do with the Ottoman Empire? Again, the United States had no war with the Ottoman Empire, no agreement with the Ottoman Empire, and no necessary reason to find itself being drawn into the crisis that became the Ottoman Empire. Yet there we were, and there was William Lynn Westerman sitting in a meeting to decide where the most important city of the region, Constantinople, would go. One problem for the Americans is that the British and the French want to operate on the basis of this map, the so-called Sykes-Picot map agreed to in 1916. And very quickly, what this is, the areas in blue would go under French control, the areas in red would go under British control, the area listed here as A would be under French influence, the area under B would go under British influence, and this little yellow bit right here, called Palestine, would be put under some yet-to-be-defined international territory. Now, the Americans hated this arrangement, both because it violated everything that was in the 14 points, and because the British and French had agreed to it secretly. The Americans found out about it when the Bolsheviks found it in Moscow and published it. So, the Americans don't want necessarily to honor this, but if you're going to say that you don't want to do this, you have to come up with something different. And the European challenge to the United States was that if the United States really wanted to walk the walk, the United States should take this as its own area. If you guys talked about Armenia for all those years and how awful the Turks were in Armenia, take over the mandate for Armenia. Take it over for Palestine. Put skin in the game. Do what we're doing and take on the burden of operating these parts of the world. Now, I can talk about it more if you want, but I'm going to just skip ahead to what Tasker Bliss thought about all this because I find it's really interesting. Bliss understood the odds of the United States coming into this part of the world and making it better were really slim. All the ideals, all the good ideas, all the wonderful things in Wilson's 14 points and in other documents simply weren't going to work. Bliss said this, it seems that certain promises were made to the Arabs. He's referring here to promises by the British to take all that stuff in Sykes-Picot and make one Arab federation out of it. In the early days of the war, and now they are so unkind as to insist on these promises being fulfilled, the consequence is a grand triangular row with insistence on the part of the Arabs that the matter be arbitrated by the United States. I myself have declared that I would not touch the question, even with a pole long enough to reach from here to Syria, unless I were positively ordered to do so by my government. Bliss is saying, this isn't our fight, stay out of it. According to the documents of the 14 points, the ideals of the 14 points, the United States had a reason to get involved. And many Arab leaders, including Emir Faisal, the great leader of the Arab Revolt, turned to the United States, going to Westerman, going to Tasker Bliss, and saying, we trust you Americans in a way that we don't trust the British and the French. You need to get involved. Now, I don't think Tasker Bliss, if he were alive today reading Thucydides in the ancient Greek, would be too surprised to know that we're still in the Middle East 100 years later, and that it has gotten more complicated and more dangerous than it was in 1919. Now, America got out of the Syria trap, but only by accident and not to anybody's satisfaction. British diplomats at the Paris Peace Conference proposed a compromise to undertake a fact-finding visit to Syria to figure out what the Syrians themselves might want. Now, they didn't do this because they cared about the Syrians. They did it because they wanted to slow the momentum of what they saw as a pro-French solution. The French themselves were furious because they guessed that few Syrians would express a desire for French protection. Emir Faisal, by contrast, was so elated that he drank his first glass of champagne. The result was a war between the French and the Syrians that further divided the Druze, Christian, and Sunni communities apart, and France also made the decision to break the Christian part of Syria, what they called Lebanon, away from the state of Syria. And this is what Westerman said: the net result in Syria is another bit of poison, which will rot the Near East until the distant day when the Arabs and all the East shall definitely discard the unjustified assumption of Westerners, embodied in the formula of white man's burden. Syria, of course, remains a bit of poison, with no answer in sight and no obvious role for the United States to play. Now, Jennifer mentioned one of the great critics of Woodrow Wilson. I've seen it at least reported in French newspapers, so I think we can say that this is not apocryphal, that he really did say it, and knowing Georges Clemenceau, it's entirely consistent with the man. Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. God himself was content with 10. And Sidney Sonnino, the Italian prime minister, shouted at Wilson during one session in the Paris Peace Conference, go to the Balkans and try and experiment with your 14 points. The point I want to make is the tension between the idealism of wanting to impose the 14 points and the reality of the limits of what the United States was capable of doing. Now, to some people like Bliss, this was a straight argument for the United States not getting involved in parts of the world where it could not have any real power or influence. To others, it led to great disillusion, as the United States seemed to get itself involved in all corners of the world, and I didn't talk about China, but I could have talked about China here as well, without having the authority to back up those ideals. William Bullitt, who later went on to become the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union, later ambassador to France. There's a new biography out of him that I'm anxious to read. Bullitt was so frustrated with what the United States had done in Paris that he wrote a letter to his mother right before he resigned from the American delegation in Paris, in which he said, I'm going to go lie on the sand and watch the world go to hell. And Bliss himself wrote, what a wretched mess it all is. If the rest of the world will let us alone, I think we'd better stay on our side of the water and keep alive the spark of civilization to relight the torch over here, after it's extinguished over here, meaning in Paris. If I ever had any illusions, they are all dispelled. Now, I'm afraid there's no high note on which to end this talk. The Middle East, Russia, and East Asia remain trouble spots, and some, if not indeed all, of the roots of these problems, date back to the First World War era, a point that I try to make to my students at the Army War College and anybody who will listen, that the problems of this era, of this modern world, all date back not just to the First World War, but to the particular way in which the war ended and the particular grand strategic visions that the United States and the European great powers tried to put in place. Now, another thing that I try to talk to my students about is the ways in which the world was changing that these so quote-unquote great men didn't realize. The ways in which the people that Erez mentioned, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Nehru, all these others, were not willing to accept the reimposition of European rule under the way that it had existed in the First World War. In that sense, the Paris Peace Conference represents a real transition and a real shift in the paradigm that very few people, including Tasker Bliss, fully well understood. Even if the United States tried to ignore the fact for another generation, and even if many Americans wish that it weren't so, because of the First World War, the United States was now fully a part of the international security environment from China to Syria and beyond, a role that this country continues to play a century later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jennifer, Erez, and Mike for 3 terrific speeches. You've exceeded all our expectations, left us with many things to think about. I wanted to pose a couple questions before we open it up to the audience. Erez made the point that Wilson's, although he was a historian, was really a historian of domestic affairs, not international affairs. Curious, one of our beliefs here is that understanding the history of international affairs is critical to making good foreign policy. So I wanted to ask, was there anybody, it sounds like Bliss was at least reading Thucydides. Were there many people who actually knew military and diplomatic history having input with the 14 points or what followed with Wilson? And had there been more historical awareness, might things have been different? So I'll leave it up to whoever wants to take it.
You're looking at me.
You got to turn your...
this. Well, I would say that it's not, I don't like dichotomies, as you can tell. So I don't think that we should say that Wilson needed to have read deeply in European history or even have had necessarily strong advisors with that expertise. Wilson was an American historian, and he looked at the historical development of the United States as a model for how new societies and new countries could form. And he did believe in American exceptionalism, yet at the same time saw the American model as something that was transferable. And he looked at the history of the United States and saw a country that had absorbed large numbers of immigrants. We had people speaking many different languages, many different religions, and we had been successful in coming together as a nation. And so in that sense, if that's the model in your mind, there's no reason that these new fledgling European nations, as empires disintegrated, couldn't do the same thing. So I think that, in a sense, his historical understanding did not necessarily have to be European-based to have, in a sense, mind that this could be a successful model to follow.
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I entirely agree.
You have to press the button.
Okay. That's good.
Should I unpress it now?
Yeah. I entirely agree with Jennifer. I think that Wilson...
I love hearing people say things like that. So.
Yeah, oh, okay, I can say it again.
Say it again.
I entirely agree with Jennifer. I think that Wilson, certainly, for example, on thinking on the League of Nations, as I was saying, this is not, he hadn't thought about international affairs prior to becoming president, prior to the war. It wasn't, the League of Nations wasn't some pet idea that he'd had nursed for a long time. But thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
But when faced with a colossal world crisis, he reached into American history, and the League of Nations is clearly based on the American federal constitutional experiment. I will say that Robert Lansing, Wilson's Secretary of State at the time, was not an international historian, was an international lawyer. And Wilson, he didn't like him personally, but on that